Hi, I am Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative physician, continuing the story of fasting in women. But first, for those of you who are new to my show, I want you to know that all of these shows are archived on my YouTube channel. And I have an actual brick and mortar practice in Irvine, California, where I see patients every day, Monday through Friday, helping all of them to optimize their lives, their health, their happiness. I am an integrative physician, so I utilize the safest, most efficacious, and evidence-based tools to help all of my patients to lead better lives. Well, it turns out that we love eating. We are human. But as we have talked about on many of my previous programs, sometimes to be healthy, we need to stop eating. Well, today we're going to extend the story by talking more about women and estrogen, and in particular, the female hormone of the ovarian reproductive years, estradiol in particular. Fasting is talked about now. It's really trending, and almost everyone knows that some sort of fasting is really required for optimizing health. But the details of, well, what's going on in the body when you fast? We've talked about how it's really essential to actually trigger the certain pathways of the body that allow rejuvenation and repair and burning of fat, which do not occur when feeding. But let's get down a little bit more to the nitty-gritty of what happens specifically in women as regards fasting. What has been overlooked in almost all the conversations concerning fasting is the critical role of estradiol in terms of getting the benefits of fasting. Estradiol is the dominant estrogen produced by ovaries during the reproductive years. Of course, after the reproductive years, the ovaries produce no estrogen whatsoever. Let's begin by introducing estrogen, my personal favorite hormone. Estrogen is a family of hormones. It's not a hormone. And so when somebody says estrogen, that doesn't tell me what actually the hormone is that's being discussed, because it would be like saying, I eat food. Well, that's good because you certainly don't want to eat concrete. You want to eat food. But what food are you eating? Food is a group of items that you consume. Estrogens are a group of hormones that respond and bind to specific receptors called estrogen receptors. Now, there are different types of estrogen receptors. There's alpha and beta, and they are primarily nuclear receptors, but they also have effects on the membranes of cells. When a hormone is called a nuclear hormone or receptor hormone, it means that the hormone has to go into the nucleus of the cell, that's like the brains of the cell, and there it binds to create transcription, ultimately back in the cytoplasm, of enzymes and proteins. So this is a time-consuming process, the production of proteins and enzymes. Now, when you have a membrane-bound receptor, that creates kinases, or very rapid responses that happen in milliseconds even. So estrogen has both types of effects. Then there's a third type of receptor that is strictly a membrane receptor, sometimes called GPRS. So you can see already it's complex, and it's so much more complex because the different estrogen receptors can actually impact each other by up and down regulating their effectiveness. So estrogens are complex hormones. Estradiol binds to all the estrogen receptors. Endocrine disruptors, these are the ubiquitous chemicals in our environments like BPA, bisphenol A, pesticides, heavy metals, other kinds of plastics like phthalates. There are so many different endocrine disruptors that bind to estrogen receptors and can alter the effects in terms of what the cells do. And this is really important because there are also pharmaceuticals including birth control pills that actually officially are endocrine disruptors. They bind to hormone receptors, in this case of estrogen and also progesterone, but because they're not estradiol, they have a very different outcome in terms of what happens. So let's talk about estradiol and reproductive lifespan of women and what that means regarding fasting. Well, let's talk a little bit about fertility. As I've mentioned, the primary goal of life is reproduction, and estradiol is the hormone that actually bridges all of reproductive functions with all of metabolic functions. Now, this is very key when you think about fasting. If you had a time in the past, and not even so long in the past, when there was no food available, so basically there was a famine, how would reproduction be impacted by a famine? This is very important because if a woman is to get pregnant and she has no food, she will starve to death, and of course, so will the baby. Even if she doesn't starve to death, throughout the pregnancy, the baby would be deprived of adequate nutrition and would become growth restricted, and ultimately after birth would have metabolic problems. And by the way, there's loads of data showing that this happens. This happened with starvation during World War II, and they followed the babies born afterwards, and they had very high rates of metabolic dysfunction. So if a woman is going to be successful, get through the pregnancy, be able to nurse her baby, and then the child will be able to grow and reach reproductive maturity, you need to have capabilities to deal with episodes of famine. So this is where metabolic functions, which is really all about regulating energy use within the body, is so key to reproductive functions. So of course, fasting fits into this picture. And of course, estrogen in the form of estradiol is going to be very key to how the body manages famines and fasting, which occurred throughout history. That was, of course, not intended. Nowadays, most of us incorporate fasting with intent. We do it purposely to try to activate the various pathways so that we can have rejuvenation and we can burn fat and so forth. But none of this is how it was originally intended. We evolved for survival and reproductive success, even in times of food insufficiency and famines. So if you take a woman who is in the reproductive years and has regular cycles, and you take away food, essentially you put her into a fasting state, she will have some effects on her reproductive functions. This will impact her cycling, her ovulation. And we have a little bit of data. I wish we had more, but we have some published studies that look at what happens when you do fasting and the impact on the menstrual cycle, which of course is all about reproduction. If a woman fasts during the first half of her menstrual cycle, that's the follicular phase, the time from when she has her period, starting with her period, until ovulation, which in a classic healthy 28-day cycle would be on day 14. That would be when she would ovulate. So during that first half, or the follicular phase, if fasting is to occur, and this was done in studies with short-term fasting, 2 and 3 days of water fasting, what they found was in normal weight women with a very short fast, only 2 to 3 days, the woman would still ovulate. But when they looked at hormone levels, they were reduced. The spike of estradiol and luteinizing hormone, LH, which are involved with creating and instigating ovulation, were lowered. So you had a reduced, like we'll say, emphasis on ovulation. The woman still ovulated, but it was under the environment of lowered hormonal stimulation. If you had a woman that was underweight and you did the same thing, you fasted her for 2 to 3 days during the follicular phase of her menstrual cycle, she did not ovulate. She stopped. So nature was aware that there was a food deficiency, and it was aware that this woman had a lowered storage of fat. So she had lower energy storage in her body that would enable her to get through a pregnancy, even if it occurred. So nature shut it down. Nature stopped ovulation. Now we know that women who have certain eating disorders, the most common that's associated with energy insufficiency and deficiency is anorexia nervosa. In women who are chronically energy deficient or maybe fasting, food restricting, they shut down their ovulation. They cease to ovulate. They also cease to make hormones. Their ovaries stop making estrogen and progesterone altogether when it becomes more extreme. Nature absolutely will not allow a woman who is severely energy deficient to become pregnant if it can. So even 2 to 3 days of fasting in an underweight woman will shut down ovulation, but not in a normal weight woman. We have no data so far on overweight women. But my guess would be most overweight women have ovulation problems to begin with, so it would probably not have an obvious effect because they're already having irregular cycles. Now, in terms of the luteal phase, so the second half of the menstrual cycle is called the luteal phase. That's from the time of ovulation until the menstrual period begins. Now, we also have some data on fasting during this time of the cycle. If a woman does fast during the luteal phase for 2 or 3 days, she obviously is not going to affect ovulation during that cycle because ovulation will already have occurred. But here's the good news. It did not affect ovulation in the next cycle. So I recommend fasting for women who are of the reproductive age group and they are having cycles, that they do their fasting. And of course, you know, my personal favorite is the fasting mimicking diet Prolon, which for the company that makes it, El Nutra, I am on their speakers bureau. So I always want to give full disclosure. So that is my personal favorite because it allows me the ability to actually eat some food which flies under the radar of nutrient sensors in the hypothalamus of the brain. So I get the pleasure of eating while getting the benefits of fasting, because water fasting for several days is not an easy thing for us to do. So you're not going to get great compliance, including of myself, if I try to water fast on a regular basis. For example, once every 3 months. That is still not easy to do, to get people to stop eating and only take in water for 4 days in a row. So, but for whatever type of fasting that is done, when it's multiple days in a row that we're talking about, 2, 3, 4, or 5 days in a row, I recommend it be done in the mid portion of the luteal phase. Now, there are some interesting benefits that accrue when you do fasting during the luteal phase. It turns out that it increases the parasympathetic nervous system. That's part of the autonomic nervous system that's calming, that helps people to be relaxed and restful. It's like the anti-stress part of the autonomic nervous system. And that's what I love about fasting for women during the luteal phase. It helps them to feel calmer. So that is a very big problem for many women. During the luteal phase, they suffer from premenstrual syndrome, PMS. And one theory is that it has to do with the sort of altered ratio of estrogen and progesterone. The levels, if measured, actually are all within the reference normal ranges. But perhaps in some women who are very sensitive, they may have other nutrient deficiencies, like some of the antioxidants, minerals like magnesium. It affects their brain when you have this altered ratio. And they have a lot of the symptoms of anxiety, depression, sleep problems, and fasting during the luteal phase may actually be helpful for women suffering with PMS. And there's certainly no evidence that it would in any way be harmful for the average woman. But as in all cases, I always stress, please I don't know you, and I want to make sure that you get the best health care. So every time you engage in fasting, I want you to have a relationship to discuss this with your healthcare professional so that what's done is actually right for you. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens to women when they are in menopause and they don't have any estradiol. Well, they have some major metabolic problems. Menopause is the beginning of metabolic chaos, really, for women, because estradiol is the hormone, as I mentioned, that links reproductive functions and metabolic functions and regulates all of metabolic functions. How you utilize energy, how you distribute glucose, burn and store fat. All of these functions are regulated by estradiol. When you don't have adequate estradiol made by the ovaries, metabolic dysregulation occurs in every organ system of the body. That's why after menopause, you see rapid increases in the incidence of osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, acid reflux, memory problems, mood problems, sleep problems in women. Women have almost 3 times the incidence of Alzheimer's disease as do males. And by age 65, women have as much cardiovascular disease and hypertension as do males. And after age 65, women actually surpass males in the incidence of many cardiovascular events like strokes, like ruptured cerebral aneurysms, and women are more likely to die of their first heart attack. So women also have many more mood disorders than do males, lots of anxiety and depression, and the traditional approach is to simply drug women with antidepressants, sleeping pills, and tranquilizers, when what they really need is a regimen of physiologic dosing of hormones like estradiol and progesterone and maintaining metabolic homeostasis by incorporating a wonderful healthy diet, circadian rhythm alignment by sleeping and eating at the right times, and incorporating healthy fasting regimens. This is so key. So let's talk about what exactly on a cellular level is estradiol doing. Well, we mentioned things like autophagy. Autophagy is where the cell actually rejuvenates itself internally. And mitochondria have the same process that's called mitophagy, where you actually have renovation and healthy mitochondria so they can produce energy, burn fat better. So this cellular rejuvenation process is actually very dependent on the presence of estradiol. This is so not recognized, even by many experts in the field. Estradiol is critical for proper function of autophagy. Now, autophagy is triggered by fasting. So if a woman fasts and she has inadequate amounts of estradiol, she is not going to get the same benefits. Now, this is based on animal studies because we don't have the human studies, but the mechanisms are the same in animals. And this has been shown by many researchers who have done research in very primitive creatures like earthworms and mice, which are not so primitive, but certainly not on the scale as humans. And they have found the same mechanisms and the same processes that occur with the same outcomes. That's why I feel very comfortable to say what I'm saying, even though we don't have big human studies involving women. And as you probably know, because I talk about this all the time, females are so misrepresented, low representation in almost all studies because women are more complex to study than males, and so they're left out of most studies, even with mice studies. They usually use male mice. How is that? So, but we do have enough data and we understand the science that estradiol is essential for proper autophagy. Now, autophagy is very similar to phagocytosis. That's where a cell that's an immune cell, like a macrophage, it envelops a pathogen, like a virus or a bacteria, and then basically dissolves it and gets rid of it. that process is similar to intracellular processes that engulf our own intracellular organelles, dissolve them back to their basic ingredients like fatty acids and amino acids, and then construct new cellular structures. But there's a very similar process involving the lysosome. That's like the disintegrator of the cell that breaks things down. So, estradiol in adequate physiologic amounts is necessary for phagocytosis. That's a critical process of the immune system to fight infections. And estradiol is part of that. And by the way, there is some data that fasting helps to improve that process of phagocytosis. Isn't that amazing? But not during fasting, it's after fasting. During fasting, the immune system actually becomes a little bit more subdued. But after fasting, it becomes more robust, and you actually have trigger stem cells of the hemopoietic cells, like white cells, to increase in number. So fasting seems to be helpful for robustly increasing immune function, which includes phagocytosis, but you need estradiol. So you need estradiol for autophagy and for phagocytosis. And you also need estradiol for the function of critical enzymes that are called the sirtuins. These are histone deacetylase enzymes that are NAD dependent. So there's a lot of, in the functional medicine world, a lot of talk about NAD, which is a coenzyme. And there are even people doing NAD infusions, IVs, and taking them as supplements. But let me tell you, NAD is a coenzyme for the enzymes that are called the sirtuins. There are 7 sirtuins. And sirtuins are very key for mitochondrial and metabolic cellular functions. And sirtuins are activated as enzymes by fasting. And that's why there's also a lot of talk about certain supplements and other activities that are called fasting mimetics. And we'll talk much more about this. These are supplements that actually act in a similar way to trigger the same mechanisms that fasting triggers. Well, NAD is essential for the enzymes, the sirtuins, to actually work properly. That's what coenzymes do. They speed up the enzyme process. But if you give a coenzyme, but you don't have another critical function called, or substance called estradiol, then the sirtuins will not work properly. This is so overlooked, but there are wonderful published papers that show that there's this intricate linkage between the sirtuins and estradiol. They actually upregulate each other. And another very interesting thing about fasting is that they now show that fasting not only increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, these are brain growth factors that improve cognitive and mood function, but fasting also upregulates estradiol receptors, so that estrogen, which is so key to the functions that occur due to fasting, like the upregulation of the enzymes sirtuins, actually upregulate the estrogen receptors so that estrogen will work more effectively on the sirtuins. That's the miracle of interrelationships in the body between all of these different systems. So I know this is complex. It's a lot of biochemistry, cellular biology, no quizzes coming, but it's really important that the takeaway message is the following. Estradiol is very key to having a healthy woman. And part of being healthy means sometimes you eat and sometimes you fast. And estradiol is a very prominent factor, in fact, a critical factor in regulating how fasting works in the human body, in the female body, to help all the functions that are benefited by fasting to actually occur. In the absence of estradiol, and that could be when there's a great many endocrine disruptors in the body, like too many plastics and chemicals, flame retardants, even pharmaceuticals potentially, like birth control pills, which are altered in terms of what happens with women's natural hormones. And of course, after menopause, when there is no production of estradiol from the ovaries, that if a woman does fast, she will not get the same benefits. It does not appear based on basic science research, not human research, because we don't have that yet, but basic science research, that you will not get the same benefits because estradiol is so critical to proper functioning of the cell in terms of the mechanisms that are induced by fasting relating to the sirtuins and relating to then the autophagy and even the immune functions of phagocytosis. So, a woman in menopause will be best served by taking hormone replacement therapy. That is my expert opinion on the subject. A woman during the reproductive years will have the best health and the best response to fasting if she limits exposures to the chemicals in our environments that are known as endocrine disruptors, also known as xenoestrogens, which impact, as we know, so many cellular functions. In fact, many of these chemicals are known as diabesogens. They induce diabetes and obesity, but no one thinks about, well, how is that happening? It's happening because it's blocking the effects of estradiol. And therefore, you're going to have metabolic dysregulation without proper levels of estradiol. So, and remember, I'm not talking so much about men, but men have tons of estradiol. They make it on site in organs, what we call paracrine, through conversion of testosterone and also making it from scratch. We call that de novo from cholesterol. That's why very low cholesterol is not beneficial. What we want is control of inflammation. We want everything to be in balance. And we'll talk more about cholesterol another day because cholesterol is essential for life. It's not our enemy. It just needs to be properly balanced, like everything else in the body. So, when women fast during the reproductive years, they should fast during the luteal phase, after ovulation, so it does not impact hormonal levels or even potentially suppress ovulation altogether. If a woman is actively trying to become pregnant, she should not do multi-day fasting, please, not at all. That should be done in preparation for getting pregnant because the body has nutrient sensors, and if it senses that there's inadequate food, it's going to shut down all of the fertility. It does not want you to get pregnant in an absence of adequate nutritional status. I'm going to talk in the future about another area that is really fascinating. It's the relationship of fasting, estrogen, and I'll say estrogen, but I'm talking about estradiol, and the endocannabinoid system. That's a complex system of lipid mediators that is very impacted by dysregulated metabolism and can also be repaired, and the system made to be more regulated and back to a normal state with fasting. Also very complex and very interrelated with estradiol. So the takeaway message is estradiol is a critically important hormone. Loss of estradiol or blockage of the estradiol receptors by chemicals that are estrogen mimics, endocrine disruptors, will impact on all the metabolic functions of the female body and as well will limit the benefits of fasting. So we definitely will do best when we incorporate fasting. We get all the wonderful triggers of fasting, autophagy, and so forth. We'll increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, we'll be healthier, smarter, have less fatty liver, less visceral fat. And I'm going to talk in the future more about the relationship of fasting, women, estradiol, and the gut microbiome, which is another big issue. So it's like a reboot. So just a hint of things to come. Fasting helps to reboot the gut microbiome. And we're going to talk more about the circadian rhythm. It also helps to reset it in a proper way. But all of these functions, everything I've talked about in the past and we'll talk about in the future in women, depend for their optimal effect on having physiologic levels of estradiol in the body. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to having you join me for the next installment of fasting for women. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay well. Bye.